Welcome back, dear listeners. This evening we will uncover why being condemned to the mines in ancient Rome was seen not as punishment alone, but as a descent into a world harsher than final silence itself. If you enjoy these thoughtful journeys into history, remember to like and subscribe. It helps this channel continue. And write in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is now. It is always interesting to know who is joining us from different corners of the world. Now, turn down the lights, perhaps let a faint hum accompany you, and let's step together into this night's story. I was 23 years old when the magistrate spoke my name for the final time as a free man. 23, with calloused hands already familiar with honest labour, and eyes that still remembered how morning light painted the olive groves of my father's farm. The sentence came swift and absolute, damnatio ad metalla. Condemnation to the mines. They called it mercy, you understand. A reprieve from the sharp conclusion that awaited so many who had raised their voices against the tax collectors of Nerva's administration. But mercy, I learned, can wear many faces, and sometimes the cruelest face is the one that promises tomorrow when today has already become unbearable. Would you recognize despair in the sound of a pick striking stone? Could you imagine a life where sunlight became a stranger, where the sky shrank to nothing more than a distant memory painted in shades of blue you could no longer quite recall? I've lived such a life, and though my hair has grown grey in the decades since my release, for even imperial justice sometimes shows unexpected clemency to those who survive long enough, the weight of that stone still presses against my chest when I close my eyes. The journey south from my village near Emerita Augusta took 12 days in chains. 12 days of shuffling steps and iron that bit into the flesh around my ankles until walking became a peculiar dance of accommodation. The other condemned men, for we numbered nearly 40 in that miserable procession, spoke little after the first few days. What words could encompass the transformation we were undergoing? We were ceasing to be citizens, ceasing to be men with names and histories, becoming instead something else entirely. Tools, perhaps, or raw material to be consumed in the service of empire. The mines of Cartagena sprawled across the hills like some vast, infected wound in the earth's flesh. From a distance, you might mistake the activity for industry, and indeed it was, the most profitable industry in all Hispania. Silver poured from those tunnels in quantities that staggered the imagination, flowing northward to Rome where it would be transformed into coins bearing the emperor's profile, funding legions and aqueducts and the 1,000 daily extravagances of power. But draw closer, as we were compelled to do, and industry revealed its truer face. The settlement itself squatted in the valley like a collection of broken teeth. Barracks for the condemned stretched in endless rows, their walls blackened by smoke and time. Beyond them stood the more substantial dwellings of the overseers and engineers, men who had grown wealthy managing misery on behalf of distant masters. And beyond even these, barely visible through the perpetual haze of dust and smoke, rose the entrance to the underworld itself, great dark mouths in the hillside, swallowing men each dawn and disgorging them fewer in number each dusk. They processed us like grain. First came the branding, a mark seared into the flesh of our forearms identifying us as property of the imperial treasury. The iron was heated until it glowed like a small sun, and when it touched flesh, the smell, well, some scents lodged themselves so deeply in memory that they become permanent residents. Then came the chains, not the temporary restraints of our journey, but permanent fixtures, iron rings cunningly wrought that encircled our ankles and could not be removed by any means available to condemned men. Each ring connected to a short length of chain, enough to allow shuffling movement, insufficient for any stride that might be called walking. The overseer who received our group was a man called Gaius Lucilius, a former centurion whose scarred face spoke of campaigns in Germania. He addressed us with the casual authority of one accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are no longer who you were," he said, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard where we knelt in the dust. "You are no longer citizens of Rome, no longer sons or fathers or brothers. You are silver. Your purpose is to extract silver. Your value is measured only in the quantity of ore you produce. Some of you will last months. Some will last years. None of you will last forever. This is not a place of hope or redemption. This is a place of work. Work or discover what lies beyond the final silence. Could you comprehend such casual dismissal of humanity? I struggle still to find words adequate to the moment. It was not anger he inspired. Anger requires dignity, and dignity was among the first casualties of our transformation, but rather a kind of numb acceptance. We were being told the terms of our new existence, and those terms admitted no negotiation. The barracks assigned to new arrivals stood at the furthest edge of the settlement, where the dust was thickest and the stench from the ore processing most concentrated. Each building housed perhaps 60 men, sleeping on platforms that were little more than raised stone shelves, covered with straw that was changed, we were told, when it became too foul even for condemned men. The allocation of space was precisely calculated. Each man received exactly enough room to lie flat, provided he lay straight and did not move over much during sleep. My first night in that place remains vivid in memory, painted in shades of grey and black that have never quite faded. The sounds were perhaps the most difficult to bear, the constant coughing of men whose lungs had begun the slow process of filling with dust, the rattle of chains as sleepers shifted position, the occasional cry of someone lost in dreams of better times. But underneath all human sounds ran another note entirely, the deep, grinding roar of the mine itself, working through the night as shifts of condemned men continued their labour in the perpetual darkness below. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no respite. Dreams in such places take on a peculiar quality, becoming either impossibly beautiful, visions of running water and clean air, and the faces of people you will never see again, or oppressively real, so that you wake uncertain whether you have truly woken at all. I dreamed that first night of my father's olive trees, of the way morning light used to filter through their leaves, creating patterns on the ground that shifted like living things. In the dream, I was still whole, still free to walk where I chose. I woke to the sound of bronze horns announcing the dawn shift, and for a moment, just one moment, could not understand why the trees had vanished. The descent into the mines began before sunrise. Each condemned man received his daily allocation of tools, a bronze-headed pick, a small chisel for detailed work, and a leather pouch for collecting ore samples. Most precious of all was the oil lamp, a simple clay vessel no larger than my palm, filled with olive oil and fitted with a twisted linen wick. This lamp would be my companion in the darkness, my sole connection to light and warmth in a world where both had become impossibly precious. Would you believe me if I told you that light has weight? That you can feel its presence like a physical thing pressing back against the darkness that wants to swallow everything? In those tunnels, cut by generations of condemned men into the living rock, light became a substance as valuable as the silver we sought. The flame of my lamp revealed perhaps 3 paces in any direction, creating a small bubble of visible world that moved with me deeper into the earth. The tunnels themselves defied easy description. Imagine, if you will, a network of passages carved with desperate efficiency through stone that ranged from soft limestone to granite hard as iron itself. Some tunnels were wide enough for 2 men to work side by side, others narrowed to gaps that required crawling on hands and knees. The lamp held carefully ahead to avoid extinguishing the flame. The walls bore the marks of countless picks and chisels, creating a texture that was simultaneously rough and worn smooth by the passage of bodies and tools. Deeper we went, following passages that branched and merged like the tributaries of some underground river. The air grew thicker as we descended, heavy with dust and the exhalations of men working in confined spaces. Breathing became a conscious act, each inhalation requiring effort, each exhalation leaving a taste of stone and sweat on the tongue. The temperature paradoxically increased as we moved further from the sun. The earth itself seemed to radiate heat, as if we were approaching some vast furnace hidden in the depths. My assignment came from a man called Marcus, a condemned prisoner who had survived 7 years in the tunnels and had been elevated to the position of work supervisor. a role that earned him slightly better food and the dubious privilege of being responsible for the productivity of newer arrivals. He was perhaps 40 years old, though the darkness made precise age difficult to determine, and his face bore the peculiar pallor that marked all long-term residents of the underground realm. "Silver runs in veins through the rock," he explained, his voice echoing strangely in the narrow passage where we stood. "Like the vessels that carry a man's life-giving fluid beneath his skin. Your task is to follow these veins wherever they lead, extracting every fragment of ore that shows promise. The quotas are not negotiable. Each man must produce his allocated weight of silver-bearing rock each day, or face consequences that make this labour seem pleasant by comparison." He showed me the technique, how to read the rock, identifying the subtle differences in colour and texture that might indicate the presence of precious metal, how to strike the pick at precisely the right angle to split stone along its natural grain, how to conserve the oil in my lamp while maintaining sufficient light to work safely. Most importantly, how to pace my efforts to sustain labour from dawn to dusk without collapse. "The rock will teach you," he said, running his fingers along a vein of silver-bearing ore that glittered faintly in the lamplight. "But it is a harsh teacher. Every mistake costs you strength you cannot afford to lose. Every moment of carelessness risks injury that could end your usefulness entirely, and usefulness here in the depths is the only thing that stands between a man and the final silence. Could you understand what it means to spend your days in conversation with stone, to learn its moods and temperaments as intimately as you once knew the expressions on a beloved's face? Rock, I discovered, possesses personality. Some stone yields readily to the pick, crumbling away in satisfying chunks that reveal their treasures easily. Other stone fights back, resisting every blow, forcing you to search for weak points like a general seeking vulnerabilities in an enemy's fortification. The work itself achieved a rhythm that was almost meditative. Strike, pause, examine the result, strike again, adjusting the angle slightly to follow the vein's direction. The sound of iron against stone became a constant percussion, echoing through the tunnels and mingling with the similar sounds of dozens of other condemned men pursuing their own desperate negotiations with the earth. Each blow sent vibrations up the handle of the pick, through the bones of arms and shoulders, gradually wearing away at the body's capacity for resistance. Hours passed in this manner, though time underground took on a quality unlike time in the world above. Without the sun's movement to mark the passage of day, without the familiar rhythms of meals and rest that once structured existence, time became elastic, unreliable. A few minutes of particularly difficult work might feel like hours. Conversely, periods of steady progress could pass in what felt like moments. The only reliable measure of time's passage was the gradual dimming of the oil lamp, and even this varied depending on the quality of the oil and the steadiness of the flame. The quota system that governed our lives was both simple and impossible. Each condemned man was required to extract a specified weight of silver-bearing ore each day, roughly equivalent to what a strong man might carry, balanced on his shoulders for a short distance. This ore would be examined by the overseers, weighed, and evaluated for its silver content. Failure to meet the quota resulted in reduction of already meagre food rations. Repeated failure resulted in alternative arrangements. But here lay the cruelty of the system. The quotas were calculated not on the basis of what was achievable, but on what was desired. If the imperial treasury required increased silver production, quotas rose accordingly, regardless of whether additional ore remained in the accessible veins. This created a constant pressure that ground away at a man's spirit as surely as the work ground away at his body. Some days, fortune smiled. The rock would yield readily, revealing veins rich with ore that sparkled in the lamplight like captured stars. On such days, reaching the quota seemed almost possible, and a man might even dare to hope for sufficient food to restore some small measure of strength. But other days, and these seemed far more numerous, the rock proved stubborn. Hours of back-breaking labour might produce only handfuls of promising material, leaving a man to face the choice between accepting punishment or attempting to work beyond his body's capacity. I learned to recognize the sound of desperation in the tunnels around me. It had a particular quality, a frantic acceleration of pickaxe blows, as a man realized that darkness was approaching and his day's quota remained unmet. Sometimes this desperation led to success, as panic lent strength to tired muscles. More often, it led to exhaustion so complete that the man could no longer lift his tools, could no longer distinguish promising ore from worthless rock, could no longer maintain the careful balance required to keep his lamp burning. The lamps, you see, were both salvation and torment. The oil was measured precisely, allocated in quantities calculated to last exactly one shift. Use it too freely early in the day, and you would find yourself working in darkness as the flame guttered and died. Conserve it too carefully, and you would struggle to see well enough to identify valuable ore, reducing your efficiency and endangering your quota. Each condemned man developed his own relationship with his lamp, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated how much oil remained, adjusting the wick to control the flame's intensity, protecting the precious light from the drafts that occasionally swept through the tunnels. And what of the darkness when the lamps finally failed? Could you imagine labour conducted entirely by touch, feeling for the texture of ore in solid rock, swinging the pick blindly, and hoping to strike something productive? I have worked in such darkness, guided only by the memory of where promising veins might run, and I can tell you that darkness has a weight and presence unlike anything experienced on the surface. It presses against your eyes like a physical substance. It whispers suggestions of obstacles and dangers that may or may not exist. It transforms familiar passages into alien landscapes, where every step becomes an act of faith. The other condemned men became my companions in this strange world. Though friendship as free men understand it could hardly exist in such circumstances, we were bound together by shared misery rather than affection, by common need rather than mutual choice. Yet even under such conditions, something resembling camaraderie could develop. We shared techniques for reading the rock, warned each other of particularly dangerous passages, and occasionally redistributed ore when one man's fortune exceeded his quota, and another's fell short. There was Lucius, a former soldier who had been condemned for speaking against a corrupt tribune. He possessed an uncanny ability to identify promising veins, running his fingers along the rock face like a blind man reading letters carved in stone. His advice saved me countless hours of fruitless labour during my early weeks underground. There was Gaius, a merchant who had been accused, probably falsely, of selling grain intended for the legions to private buyers. He had developed a system for conserving lamp oil that involved working in teams, with men taking turns providing light, while others worked in temporary darkness. This cooperation was technically forbidden, but the overseers rarely descended deep enough into the workings to observe such arrangements. And there was Quintus, a farmer like myself, who had been condemned for failing to pay taxes during a year of poor harvest. He spoke little, but his presence provided a strange comfort. Here was another man who remembered the feel of honest soil beneath his feet, who had known the satisfaction of work that produced food rather than wealth for distant masters. Sometimes, during brief rest periods, we would speak quietly of growing seasons and weather patterns, maintaining the illusion that such knowledge might someday prove useful again. But, for all the small comforts that human companionship provided, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. We were surrounded by enemies, the rock that resisted our efforts, the darkness that threatened to swallow us, the quotas that demanded more than we could sustainably provide, and the ever-present possibility of injury or collapse that could transform productive workers into useless burdens. In such circumstances, survival required a careful balance between cooperation and self-preservation that would have been difficult to maintain even under better conditions. The food that sustained us, if such a word could be applied to our meagre rations, consisted primarily of barley bread, so coarse that it scraped the throat going down, lentils boiled to a consistency somewhere between soup and paste, and water that tasted of minerals and rust from the iron vessels in which it was stored. This fare was distributed once each day, upon our return from the tunnels, and the quantity varied based on the previous day's productivity. A man who met his quota might receive enough bread to fill his stomach. A man who fell short might receive enough to remind him that hunger remained possible. I came to understand hunger as more than mere discomfort. Hunger, when it becomes a constant companion, changes the way a man thinks and moves and dreams. It creates a hollow space in the center of the body that seems to pull all other sensations toward it. The taste of even the coarsest bread becomes a pleasure so intense it borders on the spiritual. The smell of cooking food, even food intended for others, can produce physical pain. And the knowledge that tomorrow's meal depends entirely on today's labor adds a desperate edge to every swing of the pick. Water, too, took on qualities I had never before appreciated. The water provided for condemned men had been drawn from wells that penetrated deep into the earth, giving it a mineral taste that spoke of stone and metal and depths where sunlight had never penetrated. It was not pleasant, but it was wet, and wetness became precious when your mouth filled constantly with rock dust and your throat burned from breathing the thick air of the tunnels. Sometimes, if fortune favored us, we might encounter natural springs in the deeper workings water that seeped through cracks in the rock and collected in small pools. Such water tasted of the earth's secrets, and drinking it felt almost like communion with powers older than Rome. The clothing issued to condemned men reflected our status with brutal efficiency. Rough tunics woven from the cheapest available fabric, designed to last just long enough to justify their cost. No cloaks or additional layers despite the chill that pervaded the deeper tunnels. Our feet were wrapped in strips of leather that provided minimal protection against the sharp edges of broken stone, but could be replaced cheaply when they wore through. Everything we wore bore the particular stains and odors of underground labor. Rock dust that penetrated every fiber, the salt of dried sweat, the oil from countless lamp fillings, the metallic scent of iron tools. But it was the chains that truly defined our condition. Those iron rings around our ankles, connected by links just long enough to permit the shuffling gait that became second nature to every condemned man. The constant weight and restriction served multiple purposes. They prevented escape, certainly, but more subtly they served as a permanent reminder of our status. Free men walk with long strides, covering ground efficiently and expressing their freedom through movement. We could only shuffle, each step a conscious negotiation with our restraints. Over time, the chains produced their own injuries. The iron rings, no matter how carefully fitted, would chafe against the bones of the ankles, creating wounds that healed slowly in the damp environment underground. These wounds attracted the attention of various insects and parasites that thrived in the darkness, leading to infections that could spread throughout the body if left untreated. The mining administration provided no medical care for condemned men. Healing was considered a luxury we had forfeited along with our freedom, so each man learned to tend his own injuries as best he could. The spiritual dimension of life underground proved as challenging as the physical hardships. Many condemned men had been raised in the traditional Roman manner, with household gods and family traditions that connected them to something larger than themselves. But household gods seemed impossibly distant in the depths of the earth, and family traditions meant little when family itself had been severed by condemnation. Some men clung to these old practices anyway, whispering prayers to deities who might no longer be listening, performing abbreviated versions of rituals that had once marked the passage of seasons and years. Others sought comfort in newer forms of worship that had begun to spread throughout the empire. There were whispered conversations about a god who had been condemned and executed like a criminal, who understood suffering from personal experience. These conversations were carefully concealed from the overseers, for the imperial authorities viewed such foreign cults with suspicion, but in the darkness of the tunnels, suspicion seemed a small price to pay for hope. I found myself drawn to these discussions, not from any sudden conversion, but from a desperate need for something, anything, that might make sense of our situation. Could there truly be meaning in such suffering? Was it possible that forces greater than imperial justice were at work in the depths of the earth? I had no answers to such questions, but the questions themselves provided a strange comfort. They suggested that condemned men remained capable of thought beyond the immediate requirements of survival, that some essential humanity persisted despite all efforts to crush it. The work, always the work, continued to dominate every aspect of existence. Each dawn brought the same routine, the bronze horns announcing the change of shifts, the distribution of tools and lamp oil, the descent into passages that grew more familiar with repetition but never less oppressive. The rhythm of labour became as regular as a heartbeat. Strike, examine, strike again. Hours passed in this manner, marked only by the gradual dimming of the lamp and the accumulation of ore in the leather pouches we carried. But within this grinding routine, small variations took on enormous significance. A vein that yielded easily might provide enough ore to meet quota with time to spare, precious minutes that could be spent resting tired muscles or exploring new passages that might prove more productive in future days. Conversely, a stubborn section of rock might consume an entire day's labour while producing almost nothing, forcing a man to work past the normal end of shift in desperate hope of finding something acceptable to the overseers. The rock itself became a constant teacher, though its lessons were often harsh. I learned to read the subtle differences in colour that might indicate the presence of silver-bearing ore. I developed a sense for the sound the pick made when striking productive versus worthless stone. Most importantly, I learned to recognise the signs that indicated when a particular vein had been exhausted, when further work in a given location would prove fruitless regardless of effort expended. This knowledge came at a cost measured in torn hands, aching shoulders and lungs that laboured to extract sufficient air from the thick atmosphere of the tunnels. The dust was perhaps the worst enemy of all. It filled the air with every strike of pick against stone, settling in the throat and nose and lungs, gradually accumulating until breathing itself became a conscious struggle. Some of the older condemned men, those who had survived years in the depths, coughed constantly, their lungs so filled with stone dust that clear breathing had become impossible. The overseers made their rounds with clockwork regularity, descending into the workings to examine progress and ensure that no condemned man had succumbed to the temptation of rest. These men carried whips of braided leather, and they used them with the casual efficiency of farmers driving cattle. The sound of leather striking flesh echoed through the tunnels with disturbing frequency, a percussion section accompanying the constant rhythm of picks and chisels. But more than the threat of physical punishment, the overseers brought with them the weight of absolute authority. They could extend quotas arbitrarily, reduce rations for perceived infractions, or simply relocate a man to a less productive section of the mine where meeting basic requirements became virtually impossible. Their word was law in the depths, and that law recognized no appeals, no explanations, no mercy. One particular overseer, a man called Titus Flavius, seemed to take personal pleasure in the exercise of power over condemned men. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the soft hands and pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time above ground, and he possessed an uncanny ability to identify the men most desperate to meet their quotas. These he would single out for special attention, demanding to examine their ore more carefully, questioning their techniques, suggesting that perhaps their allocation of lamp oil was too generous for the work they produced. Under his scrutiny, productive work became almost impossible. The knowledge that he might appear at any moment, ready to find fault with whatever progress had been made, created a tension that made steady labour difficult to maintain. Some men responded by working even harder, hoping to exceed expectations by such a margin that criticism became impossible. Others seemed to give up entirely, accepting that no effort would prove sufficient and that punishment was inevitable. I fell somewhere between these extremes, developing a strategy that involved constant vigilance for sounds that might indicate an overseer's approach, combined with techniques for quickly concealing any tools or materials that might be considered evidence of inadequate productivity. This hypervigilance exacted its own toll, requiring mental energy that might otherwise have been devoted to the work itself, but it seemed preferable to the alternatives. The deeper sections of the mine, where the most experienced condemned men worked, possessed an atmosphere unlike anything I had encountered in the upper levels. Here, the tunnels narrowed and branched into a complex network that defied easy navigation. The air was thicker, warmed by the Earth's internal heat until working for extended periods became a test of endurance. The darkness seemed more complete, as if the accumulated weight of stone above somehow intensified the absence of light. But it was in these depths that the richest veins of silver could be found, ore that glittered like captured starlight in the flame of the oil lamps, promising quantities that might allow a man to exceed his quota by comfortable margins. The competition for assignment to these productive areas was fierce. though it was competition conducted in whispers and through subtle negotiations rather than open conflict. Men who had proven their reliability over months or years of labour might earn the privilege of working the deep veins. Newer arrivals like myself remained confined to the upper levels, where the ore was less concentrated and the work correspondingly more difficult. Occasionally, however, circumstances might provide unexpected opportunities. An experienced worker might fall ill or meet some more permanent misfortune, creating an opening in the deep crews, or a new section might be opened requiring additional labour regardless of experience level. When such opportunities arose, they were seized with desperate enthusiasm by men who understood that survival often depended on productivity, and productivity often depended on location. My own opportunity came during my 4th month underground, when an older condemned man named Sergius suffered an injury that left him unable to continue working in the narrow passages where he had spent the previous 3 years. The injury itself was minor, a gash on his leg caused by falling against a sharp edge of rock, but it had become infected in the damp conditions underground, swelling until he could barely walk, even with the shuffling gait that our chains imposed. The section supervisor, Marcus, approached me during one of our brief rest periods. "Sergius can no longer work the deep veins," he said, without preamble. "His replacement will have access to silver deposits that could easily provide double the daily quota, but the work is more demanding. The passages are narrow, the air is poor, and there is no room for error. Are you willing to accept assignment to these workings?" Could you understand the mixture of hope and terror such an offer inspired? The possibility of accessing richer ore deposits promised relief from the constant anxiety about meeting quotas, but the warning about demanding conditions suggested dangers that might prove worse than mere hunger. In the end, however, the choice was simple. Remaining in the upper levels offered only the prospect of gradual deterioration as my body wore out from insufficient food and excessive labour. The deep workings at least offered the possibility of temporary success. "I accept the assignment," I told him, and with those words committed myself to an education in forms of darkness I had not yet imagined. The descent to the deep workings required following passages that branched and turned with bewildering complexity. Marcus led the way, his lamp creating a small bubble of light that revealed just enough of our surroundings to navigate safely. The walls here bore different marks than those in the upper levels, deeper cuts made by tools wielded with desperate force, surfaces polished smooth by the passage of countless bodies through spaces barely wide enough to accommodate them. The temperature increased noticeably as we descended, until the air itself seemed to press against exposed skin like a warm, damp blanket. Breathing required conscious effort, each inhalation feeling somehow insufficient despite the obvious presence of air. The sound of water could be heard in the distance, not the occasional dripping that characterized the upper levels, but a more substantial flow that suggested underground streams or pools. "The silver veins here run deeper than anywhere else in the mine," Marcus explained, his voice echoing strangely in the narrow passage. "But they are also more difficult to follow. The rock is harder, more resistant to tools, and the passages themselves—" He gestured ahead, where the tunnel narrowed until it would clearly require crawling to proceed further. Space becomes a luxury that must be earned through productivity. The section he showed me was perhaps 40 paces from the main passage, accessible through a gap that required removing my tunic to squeeze through without damaging either the fabric or my skin on the rough stone edges. Beyond this gap lay a small chamber, perhaps large enough for 2 men to stand upright if they stood very close together, where the silver vein ran along one wall like a river of metal frozen in stone. The ore here was unlike anything I had seen in the upper workings. Where silver in the surface deposits occurred in small flakes and granules scattered throughout the rock, here it formed substantial veins that could be followed like roads through the stone. Some sections were nearly pure metal, requiring only careful extraction rather than the crushing and sorting necessary with lower-grade ore. A single hour of productive work in this location might yield as much silver as a full day's labour above. But the challenges were immediately apparent. The chamber was accessible only through the narrow gap, meaning that all tools and extracted ore had to be passed through individually. The air was so thick that working for more than brief periods without rest quickly became impossible. Most significantly, the space was so confined that the normal technique of swinging the pick with full arm extension could not be employed. Instead, work had to be accomplished with careful, controlled blows that relied more on precision than force. Few men can sustain this labour for extended periods, Marcus warned. Those who try often find that their daily productivity actually declines, despite access to richer ore. The key is developing techniques that conserve energy while maximising results. This requires patience, something that many condemned men find difficult to maintain when they see such wealth within reach. He demonstrated the proper technique. Short, controlled strikes directed at specific points where the silver vein showed signs of weakness. Each blow was followed by careful examination of the results, looking for cracks that might indicate how the next strike should be directed. It was labour that required constant attention and decision-making, unlike the repetitive work possible in larger spaces. The lamp becomes even more critical here, he continued. The confined space means that any mistake with the flame could extinguish your light entirely, leaving you to work in complete darkness or waste valuable time returning to the surface for a replacement. Moreover, the poor air quality means that the flame will burn less efficiently, consuming oil more quickly than normal. I spent the remainder of that day learning to work in the confined chamber, developing the muscle memory necessary for effective labour in such cramped conditions. By the time the horn sounded to mark the end of the shift, my body ached in entirely new ways. The precise, controlled movements required for work in tight spaces had engaged muscles that normal pick-swinging left unused. My shoulders burned from maintaining awkward positions for extended periods. My lungs felt strained from the effort of extracting sufficient air from the thick atmosphere. But the ore I had collected more than justified these discomforts. The leather pouch that had rarely been more than half full at day's end now bulged with silver-bearing rock that gleamed even in the dim light of my failing lamp. For the first time since my arrival at the mines, I had not merely met my quota but exceeded it by a substantial margin. The psychological relief was almost overwhelming. One day at least would pass without anxiety about punishment or reduced rations. That night, as I lay on my stone sleeping shelf listening to the familiar sounds of men coughing and chains rattling, I allowed myself to feel something approaching optimism. Perhaps survival in this place was possible after all. Perhaps the combination of richer ore deposits and careful technique might provide a sustainable approach to meeting the relentless demands of the quota system. Perhaps I had finally found a way to transform the mine's wealth into personal security. Such optimism proved premature. The challenges of working in the deep veins became apparent only gradually, revealing themselves like symptoms of a slow-acting poison. The physical demands, while different from those of surface work, proved no less exhausting. The mental concentration required for precision work in cramped spaces created a form of fatigue that rest seemed unable to cure. Most significantly, the isolation for work in the narrow chambers was necessarily solitary, began to affect my mind in ways I had not anticipated. In the upper levels, despite the grinding nature of the labour, there had been the comfort of knowing that other condemned men worked nearby. The sounds of their picks and chisels provided a constant reminder that suffering was shared, that the struggle for survival was a collective endeavour, even when direct cooperation was impossible. In the deep chambers, however, silence reigned absolute except for the sounds of my own labour. The psychological weight of this isolation gradually accumulated until it became a burden as heavy as the physical demands of the work. Days passed in a routine that became increasingly dreamlike. Descent through the narrow passage to the cramped chamber. Hours of precise, careful work extracting silver from increasingly stubborn rock. Return to the surface with pouches full of ore and lungs struggling to process the thick air. Brief consumption of the evening meal, followed by sleep that brought little restoration. And then repetition of the entire cycle. The success that had initially seemed so promising began to feel hollow. Yes, I was meeting and exceeding quotas with increasing reliability. Yes, my food rations remained adequate, and my position in the mine's informal hierarchy had improved. But these achievements came at a cost that was difficult to calculate precisely. The isolation was eroding something essential to my sense of identity. The precise, repetitive nature of the work was creating a mental numbness that made it difficult to think beyond the immediate requirements of survival. More troubling still were the changes I began to notice in my relationship with the silver itself. In the early days of working the deep veins, the sight of ore gleaming in the lamplight had inspired something approaching joy. The satisfaction of successful labour combined with relief at knowing that quotas would be met. But gradually this pleasure transformed into something else. The silver began to seem less like the reward for honest work and more like a master demanding ever greater service. I found myself thinking about the ore deposits constantly, even during the brief periods of rest. I would lie on my sleeping shelf planning new approaches to particularly stubborn sections of the vein, or worrying that deposits I had not yet fully exploited might be reassigned to other workers. The silver had become not merely the means by which I earned my daily survival, but an obsession that consumed mental energy I could ill afford to spare. This psychological transformation was not unique to my experience. I began to recognize similar changes in other men who had gained access to the richer workings. They spoke less frequently during rest periods, seemed less interested in the small conversations that had once provided comfort during the worst moments of underground life. Their eyes took on a particular quality, not exactly madness, but a kind of intense focus that excluded everything beyond the immediate requirements of extraction and quotas. "The deep silver changes men," observed Quintus during one of our increasingly rare conversations. "Those who work it become like the metal itself, hard, bright, and cold. They forget that silver serves Rome, not the other way around." His words carried a warning I was not yet ready to hear, but events soon forced me to confront the truth they contained. The crisis came without warning, as such things often do. I had been working the deep vein for nearly 2 months when I arrived at my chamber one morning to discover that someone had been there before me. Fresh tool marks scarred the rock face where I had left untouched deposits the previous day. My carefully planned approach to a particularly promising section had been disrupted by crude, hasty extraction that left the remaining ore difficult to access. The violation felt as personal as theft, which indeed it was. In the complex hierarchy that governed life among the condemned, certain understandings had evolved regarding work territories. While no formal ownership existed, practical necessity had created informal agreements about who could work where. These agreements, fragile though they were, provided one of the few sources of stability in an otherwise chaotic existence. I confronted Marcus during the midday break, describing what I had discovered in my chamber. His response was illuminating and disturbing in equal measure. "New orders from the surface," he explained, avoiding my eyes as he spoke. "Imperial demand for silver has increased. All productive areas are to be worked by multiple shifts. No condemned man maintains exclusive access to any location, regardless of previous arrangements." The implications were immediate and devastating. The deep chambers that had seemed to offer a path to sustainable survival would now be shared among multiple workers, each desperate to extract as much ore as possible before the others arrived. The careful, methodical approach that had made precision work possible would be replaced by frantic competition that inevitably led to reduced productivity for all involved. But more than the practical challenges, this change represented something larger. The mine administration was demonstrating with casual brutality that even the smallest accommodations to human need could be revoked without warning or justification. The informal agreements that had made underground life bearable existed only at the pleasure of distant authorities, who viewed condemned men as interchangeable components in a vast machine for extracting wealth. The new regime began the following day. I arrived at my chamber to find 2 other condemned men already at work, their lamps casting competing shadows on the walls as they attacked the silver vein with desperate intensity. The methodical technique I developed over weeks of practice became impossible to maintain. Instead, survival required joining the frantic competition, hoping to extract sufficient ore before the richest deposits were exhausted by other hands. The psychological toll of this change proved worse than the physical demands. Where work had once provided a kind of meditative focus, difficult and dangerous but comprehensible, it now became a source of constant anxiety. Each moment spent examining the rock for optimal extraction points was a moment during which competitors might be removing valuable ore. Each brief rest to allow tired muscles to recover was a luxury that could result in quota failure and reduced rations. The quality of ore extracted under these conditions declined precipitously. Where careful work had once produced clean samples with high silver content, the new frantic approach yielded mostly rock with silver inclusions so small they would require extensive processing to extract. This meant that even as the chambers were being worked more intensively than ever before, the actual productivity, measured in terms of recoverable silver, was decreasing. But the mine administration seemed unconcerned with such inefficiencies. Their focus remained fixed on the daily quotas, and these they increased to match the theoretical availability of ore in the more intensively worked areas. If 3 men were now working chambers previously assigned to 1, then production should increase 3-fold. The fact that this logic ignored the practical realities of extraction work appeared to be irrelevant to the decision-makers on the surface. Under these new conditions, survival required developing entirely different strategies. I began arriving at the workings earlier, sacrificing sleep to claim access to the most promising areas before other condemned men appeared. I learned to identify sections of the vein that appeared less valuable to casual inspection, but might yield acceptable quantities of ore to someone with patience and skill. Most importantly, I began to understand that the competition was not merely for ore, but for the psychological advantage that came from maintaining hope of survival. The other men working the same areas had made similar calculations. We moved around each other in the narrow spaces like dancers performing a complex routine, each trying to maximize his own productivity while minimizing interference with others' work. Direct conflict was rare violence between condemned men was severely punished by the overseers, but tensions ran constantly high. Every gesture, every choice about where to direct the next blow of the pick carried implications for the survival chances of multiple people. This psychological pressure created its own form of exhaustion. By the end of each day, my mind felt as depleted as my body. The constant decision-making, the need to remain alert to opportunities and threats simultaneously, the awareness that each moment's work might determine whether that day's quota would be met, all of this accumulated into a burden that made rest difficult and sleep elusive. The changes in my fellow condemned men became increasingly apparent as the weeks passed. Men who had once shared techniques or warned others of dangerous conditions now guarded such information jealously. Conversations during rest periods became shorter and more guarded. The small gestures of mutual support that had once provided comfort in the worst moments gradually disappeared, replaced by wary calculation of advantage and disadvantage. I recognized these changes in myself as well. The farmer, who had once taken pride in honest labor, was being transformed into something harder and more calculating. Questions about the morality of competing desperately with other condemned men for resources that none of us had chosen to pursue seemed increasingly irrelevant. Survival required adaptation, and adaptation in this environment meant accepting that compassion was a luxury none of us could afford. Yet even as I adapted to these new realities, some part of my mind remained aware of what was being lost. The sense of shared suffering that had once provided a form of solidarity was being replaced by isolation more complete than anything I had experienced in the deep chambers. We remained physically close to each other, sharing the same spaces and breathing the same foul air, but emotionally we were becoming strangers united only by common desperation. The seasons changed above ground, though we knew this only through subtle alterations in the quality of air that reached the deep workings. Spring brought moisture that seemed to penetrate the stone itself, making the already difficult conditions even more oppressive. Summer increased the heat until working in the narrow chambers became almost unbearable. Autumn brought a kind of relief, though relief is perhaps too strong a word for any sensation experienced in such circumstances. Through all these changes, the rhythm of labour continued. Dawn brought the descent into darkness, the lighting of lamps, the beginning of another day's desperate negotiation with stone and metal, and the constant threat of inadequate productivity. Hours passed in the peculiar timelessness of underground work, marked only by the gradual dimming of oil flames and the accumulation of ore in leather pouches. Dusk brought the return to the surface, the examination of the day's work by overseers, whose approval or disapproval would determine the adequacy of evening rations. But gradually, I began to notice changes in the mine itself that suggested larger forces at work. New passages were being opened in areas that had previously been considered unproductive. Condemned men were being relocated with increasing frequency, assigned to experimental workings where success was far from certain. Most significantly, the quotas continued to increase even as the accessible ore deposits showed signs of depletion. These changes created an atmosphere of increasing desperation throughout the entire community of condemned men. Stories circulated of workers who had been transferred to sections where meeting basic quotas proved impossible, leading to starvation and eventual collapse. Other stories told of men who had been assigned to experimental digging projects that produced no valuable ore whatsoever, yet were still held to the same productivity standards as those working proven deposits. The administration's response to these challenges was predictably harsh. Rather than acknowledging that the mine was being worked beyond its sustainable capacity, they increased punishments for failure to meet quotas and introduced new efficiency measures designed to extract more labour from fewer workers. Guards appeared in the tunnels with increasing frequency, monitoring productivity and ensuring that no condemned man could rest without authorization. Under these pressures, some men began to break in ways that went beyond mere physical collapse. I witnessed episodes of what I can only describe as temporary madness moments, when the accumulated stress of survival under impossible conditions overwhelmed a man's capacity for rational thought. These episodes typically involved frantic, purposeless labour, men who would attack stone faces that contained no ore, or attempt to work with broken tools, or continue striking the pick long after their lamps had been extinguished. Such episodes were dealt with swiftly and brutally by the overseers. Men who could not maintain productive labour were considered useless, and useless men in the mines faced consequences that made continued labour seem preferable regardless of the conditions. The knowledge that madness led directly to termination created additional psychological pressure for those of us still capable of recognising the symptoms in ourselves. I began to understand that survival in the mines required more than physical endurance and technical skill. It demanded a particular form of mental discipline that could maintain focus on immediate, practical concerns, while ignoring the larger implications of our situation. Those who dwelt too extensively on questions of justice, meaning, or future possibility seemed most likely to succumb to the psychological pressures that destroyed rational thought. This realization led me to develop new strategies for managing the mental challenges of underground life. I learned to focus my thoughts exclusively on technical problems, how to extract ore more efficiently, how to conserve lamp oil, how to pace my work to maintain steady productivity throughout the shift. Larger questions about the nature of imperial justice or the meaning of suffering I deliberately avoided, recognizing that such speculation led nowhere productive. These mental disciplines proved effective in maintaining my capacity for continued labour, but they came at a cost I am still attempting to calculate. The man who had once found meaning in the cycles of agricultural work, who had taken pleasure in honest labour, performed under open skies, was being systematically dismantled and replaced by something more suited to survival underground. Whether this transformation represented adaptation or destruction seemed increasingly irrelevant compared to the simple fact that it was necessary. The third year of my condemnation brought changes that would have seemed impossible to imagine during the early months of adjustment to mining life. By this time, I had become one of the more experienced workers in the deep sections, familiar enough with the technical challenges and political realities of underground life to achieve consistent productivity while avoiding the worst forms of punishment and privation. Yet experience brought its own burdens. I'd seen too many men disappear transferred to sections from which none returned, or simply absent one morning without explanation or inquiry. I had witnessed the gradual transformation of strong, capable workers into hollow shells whose bodies continued to function long after their spirits had been consumed by the relentless demands of survival. Most troubling of all, I had begun to recognize similar changes in myself. The face that occasionally appeared in reflections caught in pools of mine water no longer belonged entirely to the farmer, who had been condemned 3 years earlier. The eyes had acquired a particular quality, not exactly hardness, but a kind of focused intensity that excluded everything beyond the immediate requirements of productivity. The body had adapted to the demands of underground labour, developing muscles suited to swinging picks in cramped spaces while losing the easy strength that had once made agricultural work a pleasure rather than a burden. But the most significant changes were less visible. The part of my mind that had once automatically calculated planting seasons and weather patterns had been gradually replaced by systems focused on ore extraction and quota management. I found myself thinking in terms of silver content per unit of extracted rock, lamp oil consumption rates, and the probable productivity of various tunnel sections. The mental landscape that had once been filled with memories of growing things and open spaces had been colonized by the practical concerns of survival in an artificial environment. These adaptations were successful in their way. My productivity remained consistently high, my rations adequate, my position in the complex hierarchy of condemned men relatively secure. Yet success in such circumstances felt hollow, purchased at the cost of everything that had once made life meaningful. I was surviving, but what was surviving was questionable. The fourth year brought unexpected developments. Rumours began to circulate, carefully whispered conversations during rest periods, fragments of information gleaned from newly arrived condemned men, suggesting that changes were occurring in the world above ground. There was talk of military campaigns that had gone badly for imperial forces, of provinces in rebellion, of economic pressures that were affecting even the wealthiest citizens of Rome. More directly relevant to our situation, there were suggestions that the mines themselves were becoming less profitable. The easily accessible ore deposits had been largely exhausted, leaving only difficult extractions that required more labour to produce less silver. Some sections of the mining complex had been abandoned entirely, their condemned workers relocated to other areas or simply released to reduce administrative costs. These rumours created a strange atmosphere of anticipation throughout the community of condemned men. For those of us who had survived long enough to accumulate experience and establish our value as workers, the possibility of release or at least transfer to less demanding assignments seemed to hover like a distant possibility. Yet hope in such circumstances could be as dangerous as despair. Men who allowed themselves to believe too strongly in the possibility of change often found reality correspondingly difficult to bear. I attempted to maintain the mental discipline that had served me well during the worst periods of my condemnation. Focus on immediate, practical concerns. Avoid speculation about developments beyond my control. Continue the labour that had kept me alive thus far, regardless of whether that labour would prove temporary or permanent. Yet despite these efforts, I found my thoughts increasingly drawn to possibilities I had trained myself to ignore. The smell of earth prepared for planting, the sight of olive trees heavy with fruit, the simple pleasure of walking without chains. The resolution, when it came, was as unexpected as everything else in my experience of Roman justice. I was summoned from the workings one morning by an overseer I did not recognize, told to gather my few possessions, and led to an administrative building I had not entered since my initial processing 4 years earlier. There, a clerk whose soft hands and clean tunic marked him as someone who had never descended into the tunnels, informed me that my sentence had been commuted to time served. Imperial policy regarding mining operations has been revised, he explained in the same tone he might have used to discuss changes in the weather. Certain categories of condemned workers are being released to reduce operational costs. Your technical skills and consistent productivity have qualified you for this program. The words seemed to come from a great distance, as if heard through the thick air of the deep tunnels. Release. Return to the surface world. An end to the quotas and the darkness, and the constant struggle for survival measured in ounces of extracted ore. Yet after 4 years of adaptation to underground life, the prospect of freedom felt almost as threatening as condemnation had once seemed. What would I do in a world where productivity was not measured daily, where failure did not result in starvation, where success meant something more than avoiding punishment? The skills I had developed as a farmer seemed impossibly distant, belonging to a different man in a different age. The mental disciplines that had enabled survival in the mines were poorly suited to life in open spaces under natural light. The processing of release proved as systematic as the processing of condemnation had been, though conducted in reverse. The chains that had encircled my ankles for 4 years were removed with tools I had not seen since their installation. Clean clothing replaced the stained and patched garments that had become like a second skin. Most strangely of all, I was provided with a small quantity of silver coins payment, the clerk explained, for labour performed beyond basic quota requirements during the final year of my sentence. The irony was not lost on me. I was being paid with silver that I had myself extracted from the earth, transformed through imperial alchemy from raw ore into coined money that represented value in the world above ground. The same metal that had been my tormentor and master for 4 years was now being offered as compensation for services rendered. The journey back to the world of free men was more disorienting than my initial descent into condemnation had been. Then at least I had possessed clear understanding of what I was losing. Now I faced the challenge of reclaiming an identity that had been systematically dismantled by the demands of survival in an environment that recognized no value beyond productivity. The landscape through which I travelled seemed impossibly bright and spacious after years of confinement in narrow tunnels. The sky, in particular, overwhelmed my capacity to comprehend its vastness. During the first few days of freedom, I found myself instinctively seeking shelter whenever I found myself in open areas, as if exposure to so much space might somehow be dangerous. Yet gradually, over the weeks and months that followed my release, some capacity for appreciation began to return. The smell of growing things, the feel of honest soil, the simple pleasure of walking without the constant weight and restriction of chains, these sensations slowly registered as positive experiences rather than merely unfamiliar ones. The mental landscapes that had been colonized by the practical concerns of mining began to show signs of recovery, with memories of agricultural rhythms and natural cycles gradually reasserting themselves. I eventually found work as a farm labourer, trading my accumulated knowledge of soil and seasons for adequate food and simple shelter. The labour was familiar, yet strange, like remembering a language I had not spoken for years. My hands, hardened by 4 years of swinging picks against stone, had to relearn the gentler skills required for tending growing things. My mind, trained to focus exclusively on immediate survival requirements, had to rediscover the longer rhythms of planting and harvest. But the mines had left marks that no amount of honest labour could entirely erase. In moments of stress or uncertainty, I would catch my thoughts turning automatically to calculations of productivity and efficiency that belonged to an underground world I no longer inhabited. The sound of metal striking stone, even the innocent sound of a blacksmith's hammer, could transport me instantly back to the tunnels where such sounds had marked the passage of desperate hours. More troubling were the dreams that came with increasing frequency as the immediate demands of survival in the free world became less pressing. In these dreams, I was invariably back in the deep chambers, working alone by lamplight, pursuing veins of silver that always seemed to retreat just beyond the reach of my tools. I would wake from such dreams with hands cramped as if I had been gripping a pick, my throat dry as if filled with stone dust, my heart racing with the anxiety of unmet quotas. These nocturnal returns to the mines served as reminders that freedom, while genuine, was incomplete. Part of me remained underground, would always remain underground, engaged in labour that served distant masters whose faces I had never seen. The silver I had extracted from the earth had flowed northward to Rome, where it had been transformed into coins and ornaments and the countless luxuries that marked imperial prosperity. But the true cost of that prosperity, the lives and spirits and bodies of men who had been condemned to retrieve it from the darkness, remained hidden in tunnels that most free citizens would never see. Do you understand now what it means to be transformed from a person into a tool? Can you imagine the peculiar form of survival that requires abandoning almost everything that once defined you as human? The mines of Cartagena were more than a place of punishment. They were a machine for converting human beings into instruments of extraction, a system so efficient in its operation that it could maintain productivity even as it consumed the workers who made that productivity possible. Yet even in such circumstances, something essential had persisted. Call it stubbornness or hope, or merely the biological imperative to continue existing. Some irreducible core had refused to be entirely consumed by the demands of survival. That core had carried me through 4 years of underground labour and back into the world of free men, scarred but recognizable, changed but not entirely destroyed. Now, Decades later, when my hair has grown white and my hands have forgotten the weight of mining tools, I find myself thinking often of the men who did not survive to see release. Quintus, who spoke so fondly of growing seasons, and whose cough gradually worsened until he could no longer work effectively. Lucius, the former soldier whose uncanny ability to read ore veins had made him valuable until age, and accumulated injuries reduced his productivity below acceptable levels. Gaius, the merchant whose systematic approach to lamp oil conservation had helped so many others survive their early weeks underground. Their names are recorded in no imperial histories. Their contributions to the wealth of Rome earned them no recognition or gratitude. They died forgive me, they reached the end of their paths in darkness, far from the families and communities that had once given their lives meaning. Yet their labour made possible the silver that funded legions and aqueducts, and all the visible monuments to imperial power. This perhaps is the lesson that the mines taught most clearly, that the foundations of prosperity are often built on suffering that remains invisible to those who benefit from it. The citizens of Rome who used silver coins in their daily transactions had no reason to contemplate the conditions under which that silver had been extracted. The senators who funded their campaigns with mining profits felt no need to visit the tunnels where their wealth originated. The emperors who proclaimed the glory of Roman civilization could do so precisely because the costs of that civilization were paid by men whose voices would never be heard in the forums and basilicas where policy was made. Yet I do not tell this story to inspire pity or outrage, though both would be appropriate responses. I tell it because it represents something universal about the relationship between power and suffering, between visible prosperity and hidden cost. Every society, in every age, constructs systems that allow some people to benefit from the labour of others, while remaining insulated from the conditions under which that labour is performed. The mines were simply one particularly clear example of this universal pattern. In the tunnels beneath Cartagena, the mechanisms of exploitation were exposed with unusual clarity. There were no comfortable abstractions or reassuring narratives to obscure the basic reality. Men were being consumed to produce wealth for others, and this consumption was organized with systematic efficiency by people who would never themselves face the consequences of the system they administered. But if the mines taught lessons about the nature of power and exploitation, they also taught lessons about the capacity of human beings to endure conditions that should, by all reasonable calculation, prove unbearable. Men survived in those tunnels not because survival was easy or pleasant or meaningful in any conventional sense, but because something in the human spirit resists complete destruction even under the most adverse circumstances. That resistance took many forms. The technical knowledge shared between condemned men despite official discouragement of cooperation, the whispered conversations about gods and justice that continued even when such discussions served no practical purpose, the simple refusal to abandon hope entirely even when hope seemed to contradict all available evidence. These small acts of persistence were not heroic in any dramatic sense, but they represented something essential about what it means to remain human under inhuman conditions. And perhaps this is the most important lesson that emerged from my years underground, that humanity is not something that can be entirely stripped away by external circumstances, no matter how brutal those circumstances might be. It can be damaged, certainly, and transformed in ways that make recovery difficult or incomplete. But some irreducible core persists, waiting for conditions that might allow it to flourish once again. The silver extracted from the mines has long since been spent on purposes I will never know. The tunnels themselves may have collapsed or been abandoned as less expensive sources of ore were discovered elsewhere in the empire. The condemned men who shared those dark passages with me have found their final rest in places I will never see. But the lessons learned in that underground world continue to shape my understanding of how power operates, how suffering is distributed, and how human beings adapt to conditions that exceed the boundaries of what should be endurable. When I see silver coins today, I handle them with a familiarity that goes beyond their monetary value. I know the weight and texture of the ore from which they were refined. I have felt the resistance of the rock that surrendered its treasure only to sustained assault with iron tools. I understand, as few free citizens ever will, the true cost of the prosperity that flows from transforming raw materials into objects of exchange. This knowledge is both burden and privilege. A burden because it makes impossible the comfortable ignorance that allows most people to use the products of distant labour without contemplating the conditions under which they were produced. A privilege because it provides insight into the fundamental structures that support civilized life, structures that remain largely invisible to those who have never been compelled to examine them from below. The farms where I now work, the tools I use, the food I eat, all of these connect me to networks of labour and exchange that span the known world. Somewhere, in places I will never see, people whose names I will never know are performing the work that makes my current life possible. Some of that work is performed under conditions I would recognise, by people whose freedom has been compromised by economic necessity or political misfortune. The silver that once flowed from Cartagena to Rome continues to flow, though its sources may have shifted to other locations and its destinations to other imperial centres. Understanding this does not provide solutions to the fundamental problems of how societies organise labour and distribute its benefits, but it does provide perspective on the true costs of prosperity, and perhaps that perspective is valuable in itself. Those who understand how wealth is actually produced, not in the sanitised accounts of official histories, but in the tunnels and fields and workshops where raw materials are transformed into objects of value, may be better equipped to make informed judgments about the systems they participate in and support. The mines taught me that no system of production is neutral, that every object carries within it the conditions of its creation, that prosperity always has costs, even when those costs remain carefully hidden. These lessons, learned in darkness and preserved through decades of life in the world above ground, seem worth sharing with anyone willing to contemplate the foundations on which their own comfort might rest. For in the end, we are all connected to networks of labour and exchange that extend far beyond our immediate experience. The silver coins in our purses, the food on our tables, the tools we use in our daily work, all of these objects carry within them the stories of people who extracted raw materials from the earth, who transformed those materials into useful forms, who transported finished goods across vast distances to reach the markets where we encounter them. Most of these stories remain untold, their protagonists unknown and unremembered, but they exist nonetheless, embedded in every object we use, every comfort we enjoy, every aspect of prosperity we take for granted. The mines of Cartagena were just one chapter in this larger story, one location where the true costs of civilization were made visible to those compelled to pay them. Whether such costs are justified, whether systems that impose suffering on some to produce benefits for others can ever be morally acceptable, whether alternatives might be possible, these are questions each person must answer according to their own understanding of justice and human dignity. I offer no final judgments on such matters, only the testimony of someone who has seen how prosperity is actually produced when all comfortable abstractions are stripped away. The weight of stone, once lifted, never entirely leaves the shoulders. The darkness of the tunnels, once experienced, never entirely fades from memory. The silver, once extracted from the earth by human labour under impossible conditions, never loses its connection to the suffering that brought it into the light. These truths, learned in the depths of the earth, remain with me as I walk under the open sky, reminders of the hidden foundations on which all visible prosperity rests,